Some people don't change, they just learn better tricks. One moment they're crying, and the next they're quoting self help books. It looks like progress, but only if you're watching the cups, not the hands underneath. This is the magician's game of false change, and the longer you stay at the table, the harder it is to walk away. People who fake growth often mirror your language or spiritual insights to appear evolved. There's a certain type of man who doesn't grow. He absorbs. He mirrors your language, your healing work, your values, and he repeats the words you once used to call him in, thinking that if he says them back to you, it will magically patch the hole he blew in your trust. He learns to say things like, I know I'm avoidant. You're right, my nervous system is dysregulated. Or, I realize I was operating from my wound. And yet, nothing changes, except maybe the performance gets more refined. This is not integration, this is intellectual mimicry. Performative accountability and pseudo emotional intelligence can show up through subtle red flags. They apologize a lot, but for the same things over and over. They explain their behavior in intricate detail, but they never take ownership of the impact. They do a grand gesture followed by the same old pattern. They are more focused on regaining access than rebuilding trust. They want credit for their efforts instead of showing consistency over time. They cry, collapse, or confess, and then either ghost you the next time you set a boundary, or in some cases, they lurk, waiting until you're in need so they can swoop in and use your vulnerability as a transaction for proximity. Often give second or seventh chances because trauma, hope, or survival keeps us tethered. Let's be honest, if you've been through cycles of relational trauma, your nervous system wants the story to end differently. You want to be the one who finally got through. You want to believe that this apology is different. And when the performance mimics genuine growth, it's almost cruel because part of you feels the possibility. That's what makes it so tricky. But hope is not a strategy, especially when it keeps you in a loop that chips away at your self-trust. And for some of us, it's not just hope or trauma bonding, it's survival. Trauma bonded, deeply hopeful, or in my case, financially dependent, you feel desperate to believe it's real. Because believing means there's a chance you don't have to start over, or that you're not alone, or that you didn't bet your heart or your housing on someone who was just good at faking it. In some cases, we don't try to fix it at all. We simply try to walk away. We don't hand them a book. We don't beg for counseling. We don't break our own heart trying to explain it again. We just say, get out. I'm done. I don't want this. And that's when it happens. It's not an awakening or a revelation. It's a reflex. Because being rejected threatens their self-image. They can't stand that you don't believe in their potential, that you aren't watching their performance. But you saw and you decided they won't accept your no. So they come running, not to repair, but to change your mind. They beg, they cry, they promise, they insist you see them as good. Because if they can't keep you, they can't keep pretending, even to themselves. It shatters their world. It reminds me of Jane Eyre, that pivotal scene when Mr. Rochester realizes Jane is really leaving. Within minutes, he cycles through everything, pleading, guilt-tripping, confessing, seducing, invoking fate, collapsing. It's a masterclass in manipulation masked as love. A man who once held all the power suddenly becomes frantic, willing to throw the whole emotional playbook at her. He doesn't do it out of clarity or genuine repentance. He does it because losing her threatens his sense of control. Keeping her isn't about love, it's about self-preservation. I had to learn the hard way that rewarding false change only deepens the loop. I once had someone in my life who would bend over backwards to prove he was listening, trying, and changing. He would fix something around the house, send a long message full of insight, even read the books I mentioned. And yet, I was still managing everything, still waiting for the follow-through, still watching him default back to the same behavior once the spotlight dimmed. Eventually, I realized consistency doesn't need an audience and real change doesn't need applause. I was not going to give the benefit of the doubt to someone who only improved when they were about to lose me. I had to stop rewarding potential and start honoring pattern. When someone wants to look like they're healing, they often perform the part instead of embodying the work. There was a time when I had to look a grown man in the eyes and as gently as possible say, "You're not smart enough to be in a relationship with me." It wasn't to wound, it was the only way to name what I could no longer pretend wasn't true. He didn't just look confused, he admitted he didn't know what the term passive aggressive meant. He said he didn't understand what I meant by eye rolling. This wasn't a language barrier, these were basic, universal emotional concepts. Even teenagers know them. He had lived outside the US for 20 years, but I couldn't believe that was the reason. He was in his late 50s. He had raised a teenage daughter. Culture might shape language, but it doesn't erase reality. So either he was playing dumb or he actually was. Either way, it wasn't good enough for me. The conversation should have ended things, but later when he started parroting back phrases from the men's groups, words like holding space and working through shame, it seemed like maybe he'd caught up. Maybe he had finally grown. But it wasn't growth, it was a costume. He hadn't developed insight, he just upgraded the script. He did go to men's groups as promised, and on paper it looked like growth. He seemed to show initiative. He brought back his insights and would sit across from me and share what he learned, sometimes with tears in his eyes. But here's what I started to notice. The way he talked about the group wasn't about the work, it was about his role in it. He wasn't just a participant. In his retelling, he became a kind of honorary coach. He was the one asking the deep questions, guiding others, holding space like a pro. Every story he brought home was centered on his brilliance, his courage, his breakthroughs. And while he used the language of healing, what he modeled was the energy of a man on stage, performing growth instead of living it. I was never present in those rooms, of course, but over time, I realized healing isn't something you get a spotlight for. And growth, real embodied growth, looks more like humility than a humble brag. Because people who are actually transforming don't need to tell you how much they've changed. You feel it, you see it. Their behavior speaks, their choices speak, their nervous system speaks. He kept handing me new words, but the patterns kept showing up. He was still reactive, still defensive, still incapable of sustained change. And eventually, I understood. He wasn't becoming a better partner. He was becoming a better salesman. Usually, when someone imitates insight, it's usually a way to gain power, not to deepen connection. It didn't stop at men's groups. He began talking about I was studying, but suddenly claimed to be using in his own practice. The phrasing was familiar because I had just read it myself, almost word for word. He was parroting it, repurposing it, and presenting it like it had emerged from his own inner work. I had been exploring these concepts quietly on my own time. I never brought them up with him because I knew what would happen. The moment he caught a whiff of something, he'd rebrand himself as the expert. He didn't do the work, he studied the language of the work just enough to dominate the conversation. It wasn't growth, it was possession. He couldn't let me have a process of my own. He needed to be ahead, above, smarter, even if it meant stealing someone else's words and calling them his wisdom. Because borrowed wisdom becomes a weapon when it's used to manipulate rather than connect. He tried to win me with words. First, it was poetic messages, long, flowery texts that hit at all the right emotional notes. But here's the thing. I'm a writer. I know voice. I feel authenticity. And his weren't it. Before ChatGPT, it was love notes listed from Google. Later, it was full-on curated content written by AI. He denied it at first, of course, told me he was just using it as autocorrect. And eventually, he admitted he'd been using it to help him express himself. But it wasn't just about expression, it was about impression. He wanted to sound like the kind of man who could meet me at my depth. He didn't realize I could hear the dissonance, the way the words and the energy didn't match. Because when we spoke in person, none of the insight showed up. He couldn't hold a real-time emotional thread. He couldn't track nuance, and he couldn't stay in connection without performance. When someone sends me words that aren't theirs, I know. Like a mom with eyes in the back of her head, we know when a man is lying. The thing we don't know is how to stop giving more chances when they appear to be repentant. But while he was busy plagiarizing feeling, I was busy feeling the difference. Suppressing emotions isn't regulation, it's spiritual bypassing in disguise. He believed he was emotionally regulated, calm, present, grounded. He prided himself on his ability to manage his emotions. He even had that Viktor Frankl quote on his iPhone lock screen. The one that says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. He said it was there to remind, and maybe it did remind him, not to explode immediately. But he didn't use the space to heal. He used it to suppress. He twisted the quote into a strategy for delay, not transformation. He didn't work on the wound that caused the reaction. He just sat on it like a landmine. This is what spiritual bypassing looks like. It's not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it shows up in books, quotes, and group therapy shares. But if the energy hasn't shifted, if the root has not been touched, then all of it is just a performance, a peacekeeping tactic to preserve the status quo, not create real safety. This is why couples therapy often backfires, because it's built on an assumption that both people are there in good faith, that the relationship is struggling because of miscommunication or skill gaps, not because one person is playing by a different set of rules entirely. In healthy relationships, learning new tools and language can help. But in power play dynamics, those same tools become ammunition. They don't create connection, they create a more sophisticated form of control. When you're dealing with someone who's masked their true intent, who uses goodness as a costume, you are not in a partnership. You're in a power struggle. And if you don't realize that, you will keep playing repair while they're playing war. They are not on your team. They're against you. And if you want to survive intact, you must stop trying to collaborate and start protecting yourself. Because what helps in normal relationships can harm you in abusive ones. What builds trust in healthy dynamics gets weaponized in toxic ones. Regulation isn't calmness, it's coherence. And my body knew when it wasn't real. Before I even saw him again, before we spoke, before anything happened, I would start feeling sick. Headaches, muscle aches, exhaustion, without any clue that it was even related to him. We had no interaction, there was no sign, just symptoms out of nowhere. But the pattern always followed. Without fail, the very next day came his eruption. Knockdown, drag out rage, chasing me down, cornering me emotionally until I was too weary to fight back. And when I finally shut down, when I went numb like a dead animal, he'd cry. He'd say he was sorry. He'd admit to the emotional attack. Then he'd dump his trauma at my feet like a wounded child. I knew the script. Every time I'd hear some version of, I'm so broken. I didn't mean to. It's just my childhood wounds. Please, let me have another chance. I promise I won't do it again. And at some point, I started saying, oh, save your fake tears. You can't pull sympathy out of me like that. You'll do it again in a few weeks or a few months. You can be on your best behavior, but when I'm cornered, when you've withheld your frustrations longer than you should, you'll explode all over me again. No, I'm not going to trust you. No, I don't believe your apologies. And no, I won't forgive you. When I have the means to leave, I will. You can't apologize your way out of this. I wasn't confused anymore. My body had been the warning system. It didn't need logic. It didn't need proof. It just knew. Like a seismic detector, it picked up the tremor before the quake. It was like throwing a bowling ball and walking back to your seat without turning around. You already knew you hit the pins. You don't have to look. So don't be Lot's wife. Don't look back at the destruction you know would have come if you had stayed. If this resonated, don't let performance fool you again. Download my free discernment guide, and if you want support practicing it in real time, schedule a free one-on-one session with me. The links are in the description. Let's rebuild your self-trust so you can stop second-guessing yourself and start trusting what your body already knows.